strategic partnership. China and the European Union agreed on a comprehensive strategic partnership. Both sides' aims and expectations were established in two documents, which appeared nearly at the same time, 2003. In its first ever EU policy paper, the Chinese government noted that China-EU relations as a whole had been growing stronger and more mature. What else would you say in such a paper? The EU agreed on a new strategy for maturing partnership in which it defined priorities for relations with China. And it stated, perhaps a little arrogantly, but that's the European way, that Europe had a major political and economic stake in supporting China's successful transition to a stable, prosperous, and open country that fully embraces democracy, free market principles, and the rule of law. Since then, 2003, a considerable number of documents regarding their relations have been issued by both sides, and I will certainly not name them all. Remarkable among those is perhaps the 2018 Chinese policy paper, which welcomes a united, stable, open, and prosperous Europe and remains committed to developing ties with EU institutions. Outstanding and often quoted is the 2019 EU-China Strategic Outlook, in which the EU described China as simultaneously a cooperation partner, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. That has been quoted innumerable times over the past, how many? 5 years. It hasn't often been noted that this description of China as a rival is contained in this document only once, as a competitor twice, but as a partner about a dozen times. China has quite often lambasted this triple description as somewhat schizophrenic. Two states couldn't simultaneously be partners and rivals. That's impossible. But when one looks, for example, at China's relations with, say, India, it's not too difficult to discern elements of partnership, such as in the successful cooperation and the BRICS, just as well as elements of a more antagonistic nature, for example, in the demarcation of their common border. Since the establishment of the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, 2003, the development of economic relations between China and the EU has been spectacular. China has become the EU's most important trade partner in goods. On average, both sides now trade some $2 billion every day. European exports to China support about 4 million jobs in Europe. In China, 16 million jobs depend on exports to the EU. And while the EU's GDP is forecast to grow by around 1% this year, China's GDP is set to increase by 5%. A look at Europe's largest economy, Germany's, is particularly impressive. In economic terms, 2022 was a high point. Bilateral trade in goods reached a record high of around 300 billion euros, 2022, only Germany and China. However, 2023 has gone down a bit, well, a bit more even. In contrast, German investment in China reached a record high in 2023, rising to nearly 12 billion euros German investment in China. That was more than 10% of Germany's total foreign investment in 2023, the highest share for the past 10 years. And in the 3 years from 2021, 2022, 2023 alone, those 3 years, German companies invested as much in China as in the 6 previous years. This positive trend has, by the way, continued as far as I know in this year. In the first 2 months of 2024, German investment in China surged another 20% year on year. Chinese direct investment in Germany, much lower, but still went to a record high in 2023. Has to be noted, however, that in other European countries, in many other European countries, Chinese investment decreased in 2023. And it's also to be noted that states outside the EU, such as the UK and Switzerland, are more important destinations for Chinese investments than are Germany and other EU states. Now, there have been recently some economic problems between China and the EU. And the European Commission has of late been quite active in an attempt to tackle these. Many are describing this new position as getting tough on Beijing and as an end to a perceived previous naivety. Commission President von der Leyen made an initial impact with her speech in March 2023, in which she set the European goal of de-risking for the first time. She stated that EU-China relations needed to focus on de-risk, not decouple. Now, there is something interesting which happened in the days afterwards. The High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security, Mr. Borrell, had intended to make a trip to Beijing in mid-April, just 2 weeks after Mrs. von der Leyen's speech. He was unable to speak because I think he was ill, and his trip was cancelled. But he published his draft, which he was supposed to hold in Beijing all the same. And in this draft, he states, the Vice President states, Vice President and the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, the European Council brings together the heads of state and government of the member states. The European Council defines the strategic choices of the Union. The European Commission implements them. The European Parliament monitors its activity. So the member states retain responsibility for foreign and security policy. That is what Mr. Borrell had wanted to say in Beijing. This remark went largely unnoticed, but you can understand that at a not so veiled hint that it's the European Council, Mr. Borrell, that is responsible for formulating the EU's foreign policy and not Mrs. von der Leyen and her Commission. In April 2023, von der Leyen visited Beijing, partly overlapping with French President Emmanuel Macron's visit. However, the differences in rank between the two meant that she was clearly overshadowed by Macron in terms of protocol. This is unlikely to have strengthened her affection for China. Next important step with regard to China was the presentation in June 2023 of an EU concept for improving economic security, which included a comprehensive approach to risk management. Commission President von der Leyen announced an investigation into Chinese imports of electric vehicles. We will hear more about that in her State of the Union speech in September last year. This was followed in October by the announcement of an anti-subsidy investigation into what the EU calls battery-powered electric vehicles from China. On 4 July, we'll jump to the present. On 4 July this year, this has been followed up, as you all know, by the imposition of countervailing duties of between 17 and nearly 38% on imports of battery electric vehicles from China. These are provisional duties. They apply as of 5 July, just a few days ago, for a maximum duration of 4 months. And within that time, a final decision must be taken on definitive duties through a vote by the member states. And by the way, during this time, there will be consultations between China and the Commission to see if one cannot find another solution. What happens next? Member states will now have to vote on the provisional measures by written procedure and simple majority until, I think it's 19 July. And after possible further hearings, member states, again, member states, not the Commission, will then vote on the Commission's final determination. And this vote, the Commission proposal, will be adopted unless there is a qualified majority against. And what's a qualified majority? It's a majority of countries, 55% comprising at least 15 countries, and a majority of the population, 65%. That vote will be binding. Potential measures will then be enforced for 5 years. They can be extended. I admit the European Union isn't really easy. Let's go back to last year. During the EU-China summit in Beijing in December 2023, von der Leyen was in her conversation with Xi Jinping reportedly quite outspoken on trade issues. In January 2024, the Commission presented an economic security package that's also aimed at China. It provides inter alia for standardization of the screening of foreign direct investments in the EU, Chinese investments, other investments in the EU, but it falls short of previous announcements that had been made, such as export controls and a regulation on direct investments by European companies in China. There is nothing on that. In February 2024, the Commission initiated its first review of market distorting effects of state subsidy, and that hit a Chinese locomotive company which had submitted a tender, of which the Commission said it might be unfairly favorable towards the bidder, towards the buyer. Formal proceedings have also been launched against TikTok to assess whether TikTok may have breached the Digital Services Act. As part of its 13th package of sanctions against Russia, the EU for the first time blacklisted 4 Chinese companies for supplying dual goods to Russia. In March, getting close to the present, the Commission stated that it was not planning any measures against solar modules, no measures on solar modules from China, even though they are significantly cheaper than those produced in the EU. Without modules from China, an EU commissioner admitted it would not be possible to achieve the EU's climate targets. In April, however, there was another investigation launched because of an unfair advantage to win public contracts on solar modules. Again, the EU is complicated. In April this year, the Commission launched a probe to examine how China favors its domestic companies in tenders for medical devices. Now, in taking some of the steps which I have described, the Commission has clearly moved away from the line favored by many member states, including Germany. Still, von der Leyen will in all probability once again lead the Commission after the necessary confirmation by the European Parliament. Yet resistance could well form among some member states against what they see as the Commission's overly brash approach to Beijing. Germany and other states that like free trade could oppose further restrictions that are perceived as too intensive. France and other southern European states are particularly bothered by what they see as von der Leyen increasingly copying the US administration's policy to China. That is a view that could appear particularly to the French left and to the French right, perhaps a little less to Macron. Everything is up in the air of who will govern France in future. We will see. Other countries, the third group, are concerned that the Commission is usurping more and more competences at the expense of member states in dealing with China. That could also be a favorite for a new French government. And lastly, fourth, there are a number of smaller states for which trade and investment and technology is just really not so important. Today is the 8th of July, and it's been a year, nearly a year, that the German government has for the first time adopted a strategy on China. The strategy change states that China has changed and that a result of this and China's political decisions, Germany needs to change its approach to China. That's the main gist of these over 60 pages. China has changed and our policy has changed because of that. The strategy on China repeats the description of the 2019 EU document by saying again that China is a cooperation partner, we compete with it, and China is a systemic rival. The federal government sets out that it seeks to cooperate with China on the basis of fair conditions. The term de-risking is only mentioned 6 times in the entire strategy. But regarding economic relations, the idea somehow permeates the entire strategy. Several German policymakers appear to have set themselves the goal of at least not developing economic ties with China any further. Under the banner of de-risking, bilateral trade, manufacturing of German companies in China, and both incoming and outgoing investments are to be diversified, which in plain language probably does mean reduced. That's the view of the politicians. Most companies, however, have so far shied away from pursuing this idea. Some observers therefore say, only half-jokingly, that there is indeed a decoupling with regard to China, but not between Germany and China, but between German policymakers and German businesses. It's, however, unclear that even if you want to bring such de-risking about, how you do it. Generally, it is said, well, when we de-risk, we will do more with ASEAN, India, major Latin American companies, also perhaps with the United States, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, with which the European Union agreed a trade agreement a little while ago, New Zealand. But trading more with and investing more heavily in these economies, which I just mentioned, is easier said than done. The US is already Germany's second most important trading partner. German companies have been active for decades in Canada, Japan, South Korea, and India. It's not very clear by which stroke of magic German companies could suddenly become even more successful in those markets than they have been over the past 20, 30 years. Australia and New Zealand are comparatively small and can contribute little. The most promising economies mentioned in this regard are therefore the large emerging economies of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam. But the inconvenient truth is that while seemingly promising, these markets are simply too small to make up for a meaningful diversification away from China. They lag China in nearly all economically relevant data. China is already the world's second largest economy, and its growth over the next couple of years promises to be higher than that of the major economies of Europe and North America. Over the next 5 years, China will contribute more than 20, 30, no one knows exactly, percent to global economic growth. That is going to be more than the US, 3 times as much as India, 4 times as much as the major ASEAN countries, 5 times as much as Africa, and 6 times as much as South America, China alone. Even if major economies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America were to register higher growth than China over the next couple of years, which is far from guaranteed, the sheer size of the Chinese economy assures it a special place as the destination of European and German exports. Size indeed does matter here. The Chinese economy will, over the next 5 years, grow by more than the entire projected economic output of ASEAN countries in 2028. Or in other words, China's economy will grow by just about a whole ASEAN until 2028. Just looking at the automotive sector is a good example for this. In 2022, 2 years ago, German automakers sold more than 4 million cars in China, but less than 10,000 in Indonesia. As a production location for German businesses, ASEAN countries are also less promising than is generally believed. True, manufacturing wages in Indonesia and the Philippines are less than a fifth, and in Vietnam less than a third than in China. But the workforce is also much smaller than the Chinese, and productivity in most ASEAN countries is significantly lower than in China. The conclusion is good alternatives to China are hard to find. When they are politically unsuspicious, they tend to be small, such as Australia, New Zealand. When they are larger, such as India, Vietnam, and Thailand, they often do not really fit the requirement of being value partners, flawless democracies that unswervingly uphold the rule of law. And then there is still another drawback. Some European companies, just as some US businesses, have indeed attempted to reduce their dependence from China by sourcing goods from states such as Mexico, India, and Vietnam. When you take a closer look, as The Economist has done, one notices that these emerging economies, Mexico, India, and Vietnam, have over the past couple of years been buying considerably more from China. Companies in Mexico and Asia now sell more to the USA and Europe than a few years ago, but at the same time, they buy more from China. So instead of de-risking from China, all you do by buying from them is you insert a middleman. And some of the steps, by now nearly forgotten, that politicians have recently recommended are outright recipes for a business disaster. The new India-Middle East-Europe corridor that the US, the EU, and some Middle Eastern countries and India proposed as recently as in the fall of 2023, before the 7th of October, foresees that Indians' goods are shipped to the United Arab Emirates. From there, a rail link takes them through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel, and from Israel, the goods would go again by ship to Europe. Good luck with that. The outcome of all these considerations is as simple as it may be unwelcome to some. Both as a market for exported goods manufactured in Europe, as a market for goods manufactured by European companies in Asia, and as a source of products, there is, for the foreseeable future, just no country that can replace China, or in other words, even more simple, there is no second China. Other countries can be welcome and meaningful additions in the framework of China plus one strategies. But the attempt to replace China is probably bound to fail, or could at best lead to pseudo-diversification with a middleman in between. When one looks at the mood of European businesses in China, it becomes immediately clear that times are no longer as good as they once were, but that there is all the same little inclination to pursue de-risking, at least not in the sense in which it is understood by many politicians in Europe. The most reliable gauge of the mood of European companies in China is the yearly business confidence survey of the EU Chamber of Commerce in Beijing. On the one hand, the results of the 2024 survey, which reflects companies' views in January and February 2024, shows a development that is far from positive. Doing business is becoming more difficult. Revenues are at a record low, and less than a third of the companies are optimistic regarding growth. Other data are not quite as clear-cut. The Chamber points out that European companies' profitability is only at around 70%. Only 70% of European companies in China are being profitable. That's less than in previous years, but more than, say, 10 or 15 years ago. In my view, the best indicator of companies' confidence is their readiness to invest in China, to stay there, or to shift investment elsewhere. And more than half of the participating European companies plan to remain in China. But a growing number, around 20%, have already shifted investment elsewhere or are considering it. And again, 42% of European companies consider expanding their China operation. According to the Business Confidence Survey of the German Chamber of Commerce, which is based on views collected in September or October last year, 91% of German companies, responding companies, had no plans to leave China within the next 2 years. 7% only were considering it. 2% have already done it. And again, also 54% plan to further invest in China. 58% plan to invest in other Asian markets. So it's a mixed picture, and it's not as good as the Chinese sometimes painted. It's not, certainly not as bad as the European media sometimes painted. Much has been written about European tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles over the past weeks. I believe that such tariffs would be a mistaken approach. They are toothless in third countries. The duties would also affect EVs produced by European companies in China, by BMW, by Volkswagen, and they can easily be circumvented by Chinese companies setting up subsidiaries in Europe, as they are also doing in particular in Hungary. The market share of Chinese EVs on the European market was just short of 20% last year. And in Germany, Europe's most important automotive market, more than 2.8 million new passenger cars were registered in 2023, 2.8 million. How many of those were from China? Less than 34,000. It's a share which will grow, but it's still quite low. The EU's approach, therefore, seems to me somewhat heavy-handed. And it should also not be forgotten that electric car components such as batteries receive preferential treatment in Europe too. Politically, there has been some alienation between Europe and China. The days when China and Germany vowed in elaborate joint declarations at the end of intergovernmental consultations to increase bilateral trade, in one case even to double bilateral trade within 5 years, these days are long gone. Now, bilateral trade as well as cross-border investment is in Berlin and Brussels rather seen as dependence, which should be reduced. The promises that were made 10 years ago in the third plenary session of the 18th Central Committee that China would deepen the economic system reform by centering on the decisive role on the market and allocated resources. These promises have not been fulfilled, and I doubt whether the third plenary session of the 20th Central Committee, which is going to start in a week, will fulfill them. We will see. But politically, most important issue European governments have with China is the Chinese position on the Ukraine war. On 25 February 2022, the Shanghai Daily, which was faithfully delivered into my postbox every day by mail, carried its headline on page 1, Russia attacks Ukraine. Russia attacks Ukraine, a Chinese paper. On the following days, however, the official Chinese reaction was much less clear. The Chinese principles of non-interference in internal affairs of other states, upholding the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states, and safeguarding the legitimate security interests of all states, are hallmarks of Chinese foreign policy. Most European governments clearly see that they have been violated by Russian actions in Ukraine. And I personally take issue with the view that a possible future NATO membership of Ukraine could in some way interfere with Russia's legitimate security interests. After all, Russia is itself a member of the Collective Security Organization, an organization of which many of you may not have heard before. This organization comprises, besides Russia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Its goal is military cooperation. Its Article 4 states, if one of the states' parties is subjected to aggression by any states or group of states, then this will be considered as aggression against all states' parties. Reminds you of Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, doesn't it? Russia, therefore, is and has been for a long time a member of a military alliance. Ukraine is not. For European governments, it's a red line when President Putin talks about restoring his country's historical borders. What would happen if Germany, France, Sweden, to name but a few, were to set out to restore their historical borders? Chaos would ensue across the entire continent. And that President Putin and President Xi have been seen and make a point of being seen as good friends by the international press as recently as a few days ago in Astana also doesn't help. This has led to a view of China in Europe that is much more critical than before. While Germany has been toning down its exposure, I would say, to China over the 7 rounds of intergovernmental conferences, which we have had since 2011. First, we had a joint declaration, which was very long. 2021, we still had a joint communique only issued by the 2 foreign ministers. And last year, at the 7th round, there was just a press conference. France has taken a noticeably different approach. Nobody apparently notices it. France last year adopted a joint declaration on the occasion of President Macron's visit in China with 51 paragraphs. 51 paragraphs stating a close and firm, comprehensive strategic partnership between China and France. It provides for annual meetings between the 2 heads of states, and military exchanges are to be intensified. France does pretty much the opposite of what Germany has done also in 2023. When you look at polls gauging the view of Europeans on China, you see that they are going from bad to worse. According to the 2023 Transatlantic Trends published by the German Marshall Fund, 25% of respondents in a dozen major European countries saw China as a partner, 33% as a competitor, but only 17% as a rival. The most critical publics were those in Germany and the UK. Most significant is perhaps that 62% of those polled in 12 major European states saw the USA as the most influential global power. 62% USA most influential. China, 14% most influential. But when you ask people in Europe who will be number 1 in 5 years, only 35% said it's the US, and 31% said it's going to be China. And in another poll, already in 2020, nearly 60% of respondents expressed their belief that in 10 years' time, China will definitely, or at least probably, be a stronger power than the US. At the same time, 56% regard China's influence as negative or very negative, and only 29% as positive or very positive. European leaders, just as well as European publics, watch with concern that the elections in the US will, with high probability, once again pin the current President Biden versus the former President Trump. At a time when the EU Commission, under the guise of de-risking, strives to distance itself from China, this development, and particularly a win by Trump, could leave Europe at loggerheads with both of the world's 2 superpowers. It is obvious that another election win by Trump would be a problem for Europeans and Germans in particular. Last year, 82% of German respondents stated that another Trump presidency would affect German-US relations in a very negative or negative way. Whatever the outcome of the US presidential elections, European leaders will have to decide how to position themselves vis-à-vis the US and China. And they should, I believe, seek closer cooperation with Beijing, be it only to minimize the effect of a possible future estrangement from Washington. Any weakening of the West or a US withdrawal from multilateral organizations under Trump could add to China's global influence. Coercive trade measures, both by Washington and Beijing, could lead to US and Chinese overcapacities being dumped on European markets. European leaders therefore have no interest in a zero-sum game of major powers, be it political or economic. Their interest is to get along with both Washington and Beijing. They need both capitals as partners for global issues such as climate protection, nuclear non-proliferation, disarmament, and the solution of major conflicts, such as in Ukraine and the Middle East. That will require a sovereign Europe that is independent from both the US and China, and at the same time cooperates well with the two superpowers. Few statesmen pursue this line as consistently as French President Macron. And again, his influence may be on the wane. That is why I believe, and here I come to the title of today's lunch, that is why I believe that now is a time for adjustment. Two changes are necessary in order to bring back Europe and China to the fruitful cooperation that characterized their relationship for so long. Europe will have to cease emulating the US position that China is a political rival. China may be a political rival from Washington's vantage point, but not for the Europeans. There are no major political differences between China and Europe, and it makes little sense to constantly speculate that they might happen in the immediate future. That's the reason why the two powers should be able to cooperate well across the board, but particularly in the economic field. China's policy also has to change. Just as China has red lines in its foreign policy, such as the One China principle, the crossing of which it cannot tolerate, Europe too has such red lines, and one of them is war in Europe. It is unacceptable for Europeans to accept aggressions against Ukraine. The Europeans therefore expect China as a responsible power with a permanent seat in the UN Security Council to speak out against armed aggression anywhere in the world, including in Europe. This shouldn't be too difficult for China. It has, at the end of June, held a conference on the occasion of the 17th anniversary on the promulgation of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence by then Premier Zhou Enlai. These 5 principles are mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-aggression, non-interference in the affairs of other countries, equality and mutual benefit, and strangely enough, peaceful coexistence is one of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. These 5 principles are indeed key to solving today's pressing security issues, in particular in Ukraine. China and Europe should jointly contribute to the early termination of hostilities in Europe on the basis of these principles. That precludes, in particular, the denial of the existence of a UN member state by another state. Together, they should oppose the interference by external forces in the internal affairs of states, including by military operations. Both should use their leverage to bring about an immediate end to hostilities and a withdrawal of all armed forces to internationally agreed borders. Then, and only then, peace negotiations should be held. Remarkably, I could set out this timeline. First, bring back the troops from foreign countries to the internationally recognized borders. Remarkably, I could set out this timeline in an op-ed in the China Daily at the beginning of this year. So there may still be hope. And I hope that you have finished your dessert now, and for coffee we will have a good conversation. Thank you.